I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Спасибо.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank today's briefers. Today we heard and will likely hear once again many calls for a humanitarian truce, providing humanitarian access, humanitarian pauses, and humanitarian corridors. Yesterday, such initiatives were advanced by Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Colleagues, it is hard not to marvel at your inconsistency. Just last Wednesday, less than a week ago, the majority of you rejected our draft humanitarian resolution in the Council, which would have been binding on all parties and which contained a specific list of steps to be undertaken to unblock the work of humanitarian agencies, primarily in the east of Ukraine. In connection with this, today's statements, particularly those from Western delegations, come across as quite hypocritical. And yet our proposals, which were contained in that draft, went much further than the list presented by our Western colleagues. It also contained demands not to place heavy weapons in residential areas, not to use civilians as a shield, and their adoption by the Council could have saved innumerable lives, as the main threat to civilians in Ukrainian towns and cities comes from Ukrainian Nazis and radicals that are using civilians as living shields. The internet is full of video evidence of this from liberated cities or from those who were able to leave through humanitarian corridors, even as they were being shelled by Ukrainian armed forces and nationalists. I hope you've seen these images. And yet today we're being told that we're allegedly bombing vessels with grain as well as grain storage warehouses. The text of the resolution also contained a demand for humane and respectful treatment of prisoners in the context of Ukrainian Nazis putting videos online which show them severely mistreating Russian soldiers being held prisoner. And have you seen these images? And this is happening while Russia is strictly complying with its international obligations and there is no threat to Ukrainians who put down their arms. You can also find evidence of this in videos on social media. Ukrainian Nazis do not shy away from the most sophisticated forms of torture and reprisals. It is enough to mention the shocking discovery of civilians tortured to death in Nazi battalion torture prisons with swastikas branded on their mutilated bodies. And have you seen those images? In the context of such a cruel treatment by Ukrainian radicals and special services of their own citizens, we have serious concerns regarding the measures being taken by Kiev to physically eliminate undesirable public opinion leaders. In our letter from March 21st, we officially informed the Council about the abduction by the security services of Ukraine of civil activist Yelena Berezhnaya, who took part in Council meetings. There is still no information on her fate. Since then, similar reports have been received regarding Vassily Volga, a Ukrainian opposition politician, leader of the Union of Left Forces Party, political scientist Dmitry Jangirov, opposition political scientist Yuri Dudkin, journalist and publicist Dmitry Skvortsov, historian and public figure Alexander Karevin, publicist and TV host Yan Taksur, and editor-in-chief of the Odessa publication Timer, Yuri Tkachov. The Ukrainian security forces also carried out a search at the home of another political scientist who is known to the Council, Mikhail Pogrebensky. We have no information regarding what is happening to him today, and we await fair assessments of this kind of witch hunt from our Western colleagues and specialized UN and OSCE human rights bodies. The list of problems created by Kiev keeps growing. Added danger in the form of drifting Ukrainian mine has now appeared at sea. Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey have already encountered or will soon encounter this dangerous problem. In this context, we would like to emphasize that the Russian armed forces are posing no threat to the freedom of civilian navigation. In order to allow foreign vessels to leave Ukrainian ports for open sea, we have set up a humanitarian corridor, which is 80 nautical miles long with a 3-mile traffic lane. The corridor is operational daily from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. Moscow time. This information has been communicated by us to all interested parties. Madam President, although our Western colleagues did not support the aforementioned draft humanitarian resolution in the Council, we are one-sidedly implementing all the humanitarian obligations we have taken upon ourselves. We organize humanitarian corridors daily. Thus, today, we once again provided 10 routes both towards Russia as well as to the west of Ukraine. We're organizing deliveries of essential goods, medicines, and food to those in need. We have already delivered over 6,000 tons of aid to Ukraine, and 500,000 refugees from Ukraine are currently being hosted in Russia. Communication channels have been established and are successfully functioning between the Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia with the leadership of the ICRC and OCHA. In direct coordination with ICRC, we are organizing safe corridors for the evacuation and for searching and exchanging prisoners. On March 18th, with the assistance of Russian armed forces, the first UN humanitarian convoy traveled from Poltava to Sumy. 130 tons of humanitarian aid were delivered and disseminated. And while convoys with tons of food and essential goods are traveling to Ukraine, what's traveling from the west to Ukraine, as we all know, is weapons and missiles. Madam President, today we heard and will again hear a claim about the allegedly imminent global food crisis. As Western delegations present it, it is caused exclusively by Russia's actions in Ukraine. In putting the questions this way, our Western colleagues are being disingenuous. The real reasons why the global food market is facing serious turbulence are by no means in the actions of Russia, rather in the unbridled sanctions hysteria that the West has unleashed against Russia, without considering the population of the so-called global South, nor of its own citizens. Attempts to isolate Russia economically, financially, and logistically from established years-long channels of cooperation are already turning into an economic crisis of historic proportions. It is clear, even to the average observer, that lifting tensions in logistical and financial relations, ensuring uninterrupted shipments, and stabilizing international agricultural and food markets is possible only by rejecting unlawful unilateral restrictions. After all, the stocks of food produced in Russia haven't decreased. It is Western states themselves who are capable of preventing hunger and food shortages, no matter how much they may try to claim the opposite today in trying to shift the blame to Russia. Madam President, we also cannot fail to express our concern over ongoing cases of vehicles with UN insignia being confiscated by Ukrainian armed forces. It is good that the Secretariat has finally acknowledged such offenses taking place in Kharkiv and Mariupol. We're awaiting a response to our most recent inquiry regarding a UN vehicle with diplomatic plates DP 210015, also in Kharkiv, which, according to witness testimony, took part in combat operations of Ukrainian nationalists. We're aware of cases radical using OSCE vehicles as well, and our colleagues in Vienna are in full possession of this information. It is important for both international organizations to provide fair assessments of such incidents. By the way, publications online clearly show that DHL delivery vehicles have also fallen into the hands of the Ukrainian army and are being used to transport weapons. We cannot rule out that the vehicles of these organizations or vehicles with medical markings are being used to transport the very weapons that the West so generously promised to Kiev from neighboring states into Ukraine. And I hope you understand what reputational damage such a scenario could deal to all international entities concealing the fact of such vehicles with their insignia being used for such purposes. Madam President, in conclusion, I would like to respond to a talking point that has already become common in the vocabulary of our Western colleagues, namely that Russia's military operation is allegedly an unprovoked, senseless war of choice. This is also a formula that we heard again today. We have repeatedly explained what has led to the current crisis, and those who accuse us of this are doing that inter alia because they seek to gloss over their role in provoking this crisis. And they are pretending that they and their policies towards Russia and creating a state, an anti-Russian state for geopolitical purposes, which is something that Ukraine has turned into, that this has nothing to do with them. If we are going to talk about wars of choice, then let's recall the U.S. aggression against Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Syria, and the Vietnam War. All of these states are thousands of kilometers away from Washington, and military warfare there led to nothing except hundreds of thousands of ruined and broken lives, leaving behind completely devastated countries and condemning millions of people to destitution and a miserable existence. These were wars of choice because the United States had a choice not to start those wars, just as today Washington and its allies has a choice to stop putting out the fire of the Ukrainian crisis with fuel by supplying the Kiev regime with weapons, as well as provoking an international food crisis and hunger in a number of states around the world. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement.